This paper focuses on the auditory perceptions of Africans by travelers to Africa in the 17th century, traders and merchants and these kind of people, and the way they hear Africa and then report that back to readers in early modern England. And just kind of what that says about the construction of race, which is, a social construct. It has no basis in biological fact, but its persistence as a powerful arbiter of socio-political and cultural transformations makes this a relevant topic to study about, the way that it was constructed. Historians such as David Eltis and Robin Blackburn have noted that New World slavery was very distinct from its European precedents, primarily on three counts. The level of production output far exceeded that of any other slave system. It had a very distinctly commercial character, but the most salient feature was its racial character. And Blackburn states that, quote, "The racial character of New World slavery was invented by European traders and settlers with little prompting from state functionaries," end quote. This seemingly organic development of racial thinking really begs that question. Why and how was race constructed when it was? And I started thinking about this a couple of years ago in studying the origins debate, reading about Oscar and Mary Hamlin and Winthrop Jordan and Alden Bond, and kind of their question about this chicken and egg question of what came first, racism or slavery, and got into reading Winthrop Jordan, and he takes this question over to the other side of the Atlantic and looks at early modern England and says, clearly there were some, generally speaking, most of the attitudes about Negroes at this time was overtly negative from the get-go. And so in reading some of these documents, they are very rich with sensory details. A lot of these travelers comment on the way that Africans smelled or sounded, the way their skin might feel, the way the African environment felt, putrid, heavy air, the sound of the African environment and the animals in the African environment, this kind of thing. If you actually read these documents for that information, it's everywhere. And I think that it's very important. And the way I kind of conceptualize this is that this sensory information, this sort of sensory data, is a commodity, and it's a commodity that's taken from Africa back to England, and then transcribed with ink and paper and printed. And so this is read visually by readers, but the sensory data is so important because though these people, who many of them will probably never actually see an African in their lifetime, they may not at this point, but when they read these words, they can visualize, they can create a mental representation of the African and of Africa because of this sensory information that's included in these narratives. And it's a transformative process because they're taking this data in, and the English already have an idea of how the world should sound. This paper is just about sound, right? And so they have this sort of schema about what civility sounds like, and when they read about the way Africa sounds, the way Africans sound, their voice and their environment and all this other stuff, they're measuring what they think. I think a term Winthrop Jordan uses, he's not talking about sound, but he says they're measuring with an English yardstick. So they're looking at what Africans sound like and trying to fit this into the way they think civility sounds, because this is what their society says civility sounds like. So they evaluate these oral details about the environment, other people, to discern class and civility. And I'm going to start kind of looking first at the voice, because the voice was very important. There's a book called The Dead Term by Thomas Dekker that was published in 1608, and he is describing just sort of this commotion of voices at Paul's Walk in London. And he says, I quote, "I verily believe that I am the Tower of Babel, newly to be builded up, but presently despair of ever being finished, because there is in me such a confusion of languages. For at one time shall you see walking the knight, the gull, the scholar, and the beggar." End quote. So this confusion of languages, they're just spoken by different classes of Englishmen. But pronunciation, rhythm of speech, volume, these were all indicators of class, ability, and education. So the English were very attuned to voice, and it's reasonable to suppose that they would evaluate the voices of non-English persons using Anglo-centric indices of visceral stimuli. In this paper, and there are so many documents you can look at, but I focus primarily on The History and Description of Africa, and the Notable Things Therein by Leo Africanus, which was translated into English by John Corey in 1600. And then Richard Jobson's account of his voyage up the River Gambia, which was published in 1623, called The Golden Trade. And Leo Africanus gives us a good evaluation of African speech when an ambassador comes to court in the Kingdom of Fez in North Africa, and he describes his reception. Quote, "The Princess Ambassador was a Negro born, being gross and of a low stature, and for his speech and behavior most barbarous. This fellow delivered a letter unto the king, which was most absurdly and rudely penned, but the oration which he made in the behalf of his prince was well worse, so that at the pronouncing thereof the king and all that were in presence could hardly refrain from laughter, but were fain to hold their hands and garments before their faces, lest they should have seemed too uncivil." End quote. While his eyes perceive the physical inferiority of this man with his gross and low stature, it's through the medium of sound that he affirms his barbarity. The ambassador is received with derision by the entire court upon hearing his speech, and his crude manner of speech is juxtaposed with the reaction of the king and the court, who exhibit civility by stifling their laughter and trying to remain silent. Richard Jobson also wrote a lot about African vocalization. He wrote about many facets of African life. Africanus was often overtly negative across the board in his description, but Jobson was not quite so much. He actually exhibits a real interest in the people that he's not there to study them, he's looking for gold, but he's just very interested in what's going on around him. So an interesting thing, he goes, like I say, into great detail talking about a lot of different things, and one of the things that he comments on is that it's so hot in Africa, he calls it that fried region, that they restrain from doing overt physical activity during the day because it's just too hot. And so they kind of rest or sleep during the day. He calls it the dead sleeps of the daylight hours. And then the more audible, often, and energetic pursuits occur at night. An English tendency to associate loud voices with incivility and barbarity was likely strengthened by this reverse schedule that seemed to value darkness over light. And as sight increasingly gained credence as the superior scent in this period, as the Enlightenment is beginning, we're at the cusp of this point where sight will be associated with rationality, and this will be deemed the superior sense and the preferred sense to use, as opposed to the lower senses. So this idea of living under a cloak of darkness and limiting the use of your eyes would seem very backwards. But he relates kind of some of the activities that they did at night. Quote, "This is their continual custom every night after it seems they have filled their bellies, making fires about which they do continue drumming, hooping, singing, and making a heathenish noise until day begins to break. When it happens music is among them, then is the horrible din." End quote. Likewise, their manner of taking wives was a nighttime pursuit, an act that was rife with vocalization and violence. Women were apprehended and with what he perceives as violence, and the women would, quote, "make a noise, shrieking and crying out, after which the other women in the camp would add their voices to this noise, and then the men would steal away their prize, and there would be great shouts and cries of rejoicing, and all of this is happening in the middle of the night." Another thing that he noted was this character Hore, the wandering devil of those African tribes. Jobson reckoned that this devil served to, quote, "keep the youth in awe by the noise of his roaring voice resembling the greatest bass of a man's voice." And he at some point actually discovers this man on the outskirts of the camp. And when he discovers him, he actually can't even speak because he's grown so hoarse by crying like Hore around the camp all night. So the soundscape of Jobson's Africa is loudest at night, a time when the aural sense is often privileged over the usually dominant sense of sight. It's not unlikely that the Africans' embrace and reliance on this lower sense would invite characterizations of barbarity and animality. As the English readers evaluating these accounts were utilizing, as I said, their superior enlightened eyes to take in this narrative. The volume and tenor of African vocalization was perhaps the most obvious oral distinction that the English readers would grasp as they developed their own internal perceptions of Africans.